every halaqa, inshallah, I'll just give you a little visionette, a little powerful message with a different focus every time. We will have many sojourns for those who want to stick with me. And of course, I completely understand if you don't, because I wouldn't stick with myself. But, everything from sometimes even the world of poetry, the world of Sufism, the world of philosophy, the world of history, there is so much to taste in our tradition, like taking little bites of a garden that literally is without limit. With a focus on perhaps different thinkers at different times, there are so many friends that I would love to introduce you to. I'll tell you, there was an Abbasid Caliph called Mu'tamad, and there was a woman who was actually appointed as a judge called a Qahramaniya, and a judge and a public notary. She would at one point actually sat as a judge, but at another point early in her career, she would notarize legal judgments. And there is a very fascinating controversy. When Qahramaniya was appointed as a judge in the Abbasid era during the Mu'tamad, the Ahl al-Hadith folks, who the precursors of the Wahhabis of today, were very upset that a woman was appointed as a judge and a notary over judicial. Now remember, this is now centuries ago. We had a woman judge say sit. And like Ahl al-Hadith of today, who are the Wahhabis, back then they were known as Ahl al-Hadith, they were so upset that they actually rioted in the streets to get her removed. Al-Mu'tamad, to his credit, refused to remove her. And she, I think, to piss off Ahl al-Hadith, refused to marry, because they insisted, at least if you're going to appoint her as a judge, she has to be married. Qahramaniya refused to marry and said, I'm married to my books till my death. I love these stories. I'm going to, every time, inshallah, I'll share with you a few of these stories. You have to know your tradition. You have to be excited by your tradition. When you meet Islamophobia, you must have that sense of repose and tranquility of, you can't affect me, you're stupid. I'm not telling you to read it. Robert Spencer wrote recently a book called The Confessions of an Islamophobe. And it saddens me every time I get a Muslim that calls me and says, I looked at this and my face was shaken. Why? Your face was shaken because you don't know much about your own faith. What is even sadder is a book that came out by a bunch of Muslims who claim to be Muslim reformers, supposedly writing essays about the challenge of being Muslim reformers. Guess who wrote the introduction to that book? What was it? What was that book called?
I'm sorry.
The book that we saw at Barnes and Noble. I ordered it, but it didn't come. I'm not telling you to order it. I ordered it because I'm insane. You don't. Don't make them make money.
The one by the journalist?
Yeah, but guess who wrote the introduction to that book? Daniel Pipes and Robert Spencer, co-authored. So now even Muslim reform is supposed to be on their platform. Someone who brags about being an Islamophobe writes the introduction to a book supposedly by Muslim reformers. This is obscene, people. A book like that, the minute it's published, should have, if we were properly funded, should have 100 book reviews appearing in every journal, exposing it for what it is. we should be so well funded, so well organized, that immediately there are responses to it by intellectuals from every nook and cranny. I'm willing to bet that it will sell, it will become a bestseller, because they've organized and they buy copies that they distribute for free, and there will be hardly any Muslim responses, if at all. This has to change. This has to change. And I'm stuck with you and you're stuck with me. I can't talk to I can go in the street and talk to the neighbors. Over there's a neighbor who does porn. Over there's a neighbor who carries a camera, not a camera, a boom mic in Hollywood. Over there is a Jewish neighbor. I don't think they're going to respond. I don't think they care. So I'm stuck with you and you're stuck with me. That's the way it is. So that's why I have to tell you. Okay. So
you said that we shouldn't just be reacting, but doesn't the Quran respond to realities of the time and place that it was addressing? And so isn't that also what we should be doing, is addressing what's on the minds of people? And maybe, it shouldn't be apologetics, it shouldn't just be reactive, we should be offering something, but we should always be thinking about, why are people fearing? I think Islamophobia is part of it, but Muslim behavior, or our inability to explain or our inability to demonstrate how we are part of an Islamic ethical movement, I think is also part of it. And so that leads me to the second part of the question is, with so many now academic institutions opening up Islamic, not centers, but
Islamic Studies.
yeah, studies, centers for Islamic studies. Where is that going then? There's so many of them opening up. What's going on there?
There are a couple of things. One, you're absolutely right that epistemology, systems of knowledge, you have to deal in a system of knowledge that is current and that is negotiated within your time and place. So, it's always tricky when you push the envelope when it comes to knowledge, because you could become irrelevant very quickly, and you can become an outlier very quickly. But it's a balance between explanation of issues raised by the other and being able to address issues raised by the others and then to return the gaze and then further the discourse.
Right.
And this is where we actually fail on all of them.
Right.
Addressing the other, and returning the gaze and furthering the discourse. We actually fail on all three, which is disastrous. Now the other thing is that it's remarkable. These days remind me, and I'm going to say something that's sort of a little bit heretical now. It remind me quite a bit, not of the time of the Prophet ﷺ Muhammad, but it reminds me of Christians in the early centuries. The Roman Empire is extremely powerful. The Roman Empire is engaged in back and forth with the Persian Empire, but it's pretty dominant. The Roman Empire actually had a mythology that they used to coin on their currency, saying peace everywhere, meaning peace under the Romans. So even the mythology of Romans as keepers of peace. Now at the same time, the Romans used to demonize and persecute Christians for about 3 centuries. And Muslims can learn a great deal by studying that history, because the ability to negotiate your faith when power is very hegemonic and monopolized is something that Muslims are not accustomed to, because their own history of empire put them in a privileged position for so long. Once that privilege was lost in colonialism, they got lost. And that's what we're going through now. We're collectively lost. If I would love to have a seminar on, to actually lead a sort of a seminar, but for students of history, on what Muslims can learn from the history of persecution, Christian persecution, what Muslims can take from studying that history. You need serious intellectuals to engage in something like that. Now this brings me to the Islamic studies. Islamic studies, yes, there are Islamic studies everywhere, but no one will fight your war for you. Islamic study centers and departments continue to be dominated primarily by the Orientalist project. And Edward Said was completely right on. Islamic studies departments and centers started all over the West primarily as institutions that aid the colonial project, aid the colonialization of Muslims. Now, they progressed from that point, they improved a great deal. They're not just straight out colonial apologists anymore, but they are still anchored in the fiction of objectivity, which often translates to a discourse that serves its own normative trajectories. In other words, there are certain academic mythologies that developed, and the perpetuation of these mythologies become like a technical lingo that you preserve and perpetuate for its own sake. Now, often we need Islamic centers, Islamic studies need federal funding, they need federal institutions, they need money from the state, so they actually will sign contracts to serve the military, to so on. But nothing similar to what, for instance, Indians have done in the field of, you can't study India now without addressing Indian nationalists, academic nationalists, who dominate the field of Indian studies. You can't do Jewish studies without being sympathetic to Jewish history and Jewish identity. If you're not going to go anywhere in Jewish studies. Same with Buddhist studies. So in other words, other people have been far more successful in deneutralizing the colonial project, in decolonizing their area studies. But Muslims have not. We have not decolonized Islamic studies. We have not decolonized it because we have remained out of it, and even when we enter it as individuals. And individuals have to negotiate an advantage, a position for themselves by playing the game. Someone like me, by the way, gets a lot of flack in academia because I'm very clear about my commitments and my loyalties. I am not the norm. I'm the outlier in the field of Islamic studies, and believe me, there are a lot of people who will not even come close to me because they say, oh, he's biased. I'm nothing more than like all the Jewish scholars who do Judaic studies. The difference is they're celebrated in their field. I'm an outcast in my field.
I have to take this call in.
I mean,
I'm going to go hug and kiss people out there.
Okay, yes.
Thank you.
Visit our poor neighbor. see if he's filming something.
That's the Usuli Institute.
Usuli?
You're brilliant, by the way.
Thank you.
That is brilliant. We all need ghusl.
Let's move on.
Amir. Yeah, let's leave ghusl aside.
That was very funny, but first of all, I have to thank Mrs. Abu Al-Fadl. So moving talk. I really enjoyed. I mean, I know you for quite a while, and I know a little bit of your experience.
All these years she's been quiet.
Yes,
I've oppressed
I know.
her for so
I
many years.
know. But today's talk was wonderful. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
sharing your experience, your thoughts. I mean, I'm going to show your part of the video specifically to my daughter because she's thriving to become a feminist, Muslim feminist, and you make a real model for her to study and think and really give a deep thought about how one woman transforms from one point to another point, and your transition from all these points are amazing. I mean, I was moved, although I know you for more than 10 years now, but I knew how wonderful you are, and I know how wonderful you have been to my mentor and Ustad, and your kids, but this was something truly moving. Thank you so much.
You're gonna make me cry.
No, I'm being honest.
I joke about oppressing her, but I'm actually not quite joking. Yeah, you know, but I'll tell you, Greece's excitement about Islam is inspiring. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times where something happens and because of her Islam, because she's a real Muslim, not like us who just inherited Islam, she's saying, this is not Islamic. How can you be quiet? How can you accept this? You have to do this. And I have to, I'm always calming her down. And she's like gun-ho, ready to conquer the world. And, yeah. So
Yeah,
I do hold her back.
We're watching the disturbing shows on Netflix, and then she's the one who's pushing you to action and getting us to stop,
Yeah.
to get off the TV.
I mean, her passion comes from her brilliance to
Aw,
begin with.
thank you. Okay, checks in the mail, okay?
But regarding the purpose of, the question that was in the email and your speech today, Muslim society in the past 100 years, as you said, has been in the reactive mode. And that's, as you mentioned, that we have to respond to this issue or that issue, which may or may not be belonging to us. But we have to sort of answer some and offer some ideas to see if it meets the contours of the methodology of knowledge or the designation of the sources of knowledge that dominates today's academia, and I think we're missing our sources. And as you mentioned, we're not able to call on people and say, okay, you're offering your sources of knowledge, but you're completely ignoring ours.
Exactly.
And you're not allowing us to introduce our sources of knowledge. That's why, as I'm sure you know, and you mentioned it actually several times in the latter part of your speech, that we have to decolonize a lot of things. And the singularity of the Muslim intellectuals in this society, you're in the middle of many things. You know much more than anyone else in the field. But the singularity and being becoming isolated, it's actually a norm rather than exception. I taught a course, as I'm sure you remember, constitutional transition in Muslim societies in our very own Islamic Studies department. I was never invited to continue, and that was the only time.
Yeah,
And it was in a very basic level. I couldn't, you know.
And let me add to this, because my relationship with Allah forces me to testify. This is shahada. And because this is what my personal relationship with Allah demands of me. Allah's constantly talking in my ear saying, testify. And often the way I testify gets me into a lot of trouble. So here goes. At the same time that my school, including the UCLA Law School, including the what's the name of the International Institute? What is it called?
The international.
International
It is the
Institute,
international
Islamic
institute.
Studies department.
We have a lot of ongoing courses on Israeli constitutionalism.
Yeah, I know.
We have scholars from Israel. We fly them to come to teach at UCLA Law School all the time. I couldn't get your course, and I went and I talked to several faculty. We need, the history of constitutionalism in the Muslim world is important. We're killing Muslims. We've killed 2 million of them. At least let's teach something about them. No.
I know.
Now, the reason, of course, is there is financial backing for Israeli constitutionalism.
Yeah, I know.
There's a lot of money that the law school would lose if the law school is not being receptive. And there's a lot of faculty who are very sympathetic to Israel, who love Israel, who visit Israel regularly. They don't care about Muslims. This is the tangible reality that must change. The fact that it's good that we have a Muslim faculty member that is able to make it to UCLA Law School, but the pressures on us as individuals are enormous. And I mean, the witch hunts that go on to threaten us that we might lose our jobs if we continue speaking out, as you know, are mind-boggling
I know.
all the time.
I know.
Daniel Pipes was even very blunt in his article where he said, Khalid al-Fat slipped through our dragnet. We should not allow another Khalid al-Fat to slip through. He wrote this in an article that he published. Greece can supply you with it. This should be a clear indication to Muslims as to where they should put their money and their energies. The response should be, in theory, all these doctors that are making millions of dollars and buying mansions and second and third cars and talking about, they should be immediately creating funds to finance anyone that wants to go into intellectual and academic work. That, in theory, should be. And then the other thing you point, Muslim sources. As you know, and again, we've known each other for a long time. I have read so much philosophy in my life. I mean, sometimes when you read philosophy to the point that you start becoming on the cusp of insanity. and I've reached that point. You know, you start seeing things and hearing voices and stuff like that. The philosophy does that to you. One of the most exquisite philosophers that I've read is Mulla Sadra. Mulla Sadra should be a philosopher unto nations, a guiding philosopher in. If Mulla Sadra would have been born Christian or Jewish, he would be a Kant of our age. We would all be talking about Mulla Sadra as a Kant. There would be hundreds of books studying his philosophy, hundreds of books about his life, hundreds of books disagreeing about what he meant by this and what he meant by that. That's not the reality. You can't put 10 books together on Mulla Sadra, and most of them are not even. This is the abandonment of the Islamic tradition. And we've abandoned it because we are, our smartest people go into the physical sciences, which means making money, which in turn they spend on consumption. And our government, the governments, well, I shouldn't say our governments, because I consider my government to be the US. I have no other government over me. My government is the American government. But Muslim governments, governments of Muslim countries, are primarily concerned with the Islamic tradition only to the extent that it can support their power, but nothing beyond. And so the funding for intellectual investigation is non-existent. When I get people from Pakistan, I mean, I feel so sad to the lack of intellectual sophistication from academics in Pakistan and Iran and Egypt and Jordan, and Morocco's a little bit better, but not even much better. I see as the only sprout of hope are Muslims in the West. But it requires that they stop buying cars and fancy furniture and buy books instead and invest in intellects. Now, is that a crazy dream? And of course, stop building mosques, because is that such a wild dream? You know, yes, I've been dreaming it now for 30 years and it hasn't happened. But even if it happens after I leave this world, I'll be happy in my death. That's a testimony that I have to keep giving. And there's so much in our tradition. There is, as you know, because you've spent how many years now studying that tradition?
At least 15 years.
Yeah. I mean, it is remarkably rich intellectual tradition.
Oh, yeah.
Come on.
Wait, I'm sorry, can I just, I'm going to just insert, because we have a few questions from the UK and Australia.
Yeah, correct.
And it's like very late for them, so they've been hanging in with us. So I have 3 questions. I'll just read all 3 and then.
So
you can attempt.
one of the, you know, pain. This is the great teacher, pain, and losing sleep is pain. So celebrate the pain.
Okay, so the first question has to do whether your Usuli principles are somewhat arbitrary and subjective, like from speaking in God's name, and whether the 5 pillars are quote-unquote enough as a foundation for Islam. So in relation to chapter 4, verse 135, and 5, verse 8, which taken together would seem to indicate a certain intrinsic relationship between God and justice. So that's the first question. Okay, and then the second question is, you previously mentioned that following a madhab isn't required. Can you unpack this a little more? Do you see us as still needing to follow conventional fiqh, but free from boundaries, or are you hinting at a more radical change? And then the last one is a personal question regarding music. This person's personal taste runs to death metal, a genre that fuses horror, aesthetic, and lyrical themes. Is that haram or halal?
Okay, God, you know, it's sort of ranging. Okay, all right. So the usuli first. This is a good question, and I was going to talk about even why the name usuli. the Usuli Institute. Some of you might know that in the Shia world, there has been a conflict between two schools of thought, the Usuli and the Akhbari. And this is not what I'm referring to. I mean, this is not necessarily an endorsement of any side of this conflict. What is meant by Usuli is a methodological movement in Islamic history that doesn't look at the law as its own objective, that extracts from revelation and from reason normative principles, قواعد أصلية, that become guiding praxes, guiding rules for interpretation, for further interpretation. So for instance, when we say that a principle that there is a presumption of non-responsibility, everyone is presumed not to have a duty to do something unless there is evidence to create an obligation. That's a qaida asliya. That's a principle, a normative principle that you deduce from a study of a variety of sources. When we say that a principle, ad-darar yuzal, harm must be removed. Wherever there is harm, you have an obligation to end that harm. Is that whimsical? Absolutely not. It's a systematic, methodological study of a variety of sources, some of them based on reason, some of them based on text. But this systematic study of sources leads you to an interpretive principle that then becomes a normative guide for understanding your relationship with the divine and your relationship with creation. Now, I am not so dogmatic to say, oh, what I'm embracing are the principles found in Ashbah wal Nazair by Ibn Nujaym in Hanafi school, or the principles found by Al-Izz bin Abdul Salam in the Shafi'i school, or that's dogmatism. What I am adopting is the principle of principles. In other words, the principle of methodological rigor in saying that the law must have ideals, must have principles which become then aspirational for us. Now, of course, since I've published Speaking God's Name, you know, Muslims, there are a lot of Muslims who said, oh, you know, well, you know, aren't you adopting subjective principles? And they mix between subjective and whimsical. Often people who have not studied philosophy think that subjective means whimsical. Well, guess what? If you study philosophy, you realize everything is subjective, but it's not whimsical. There's a huge difference between whimsical and subjective. And the principles which I anchor myself on in Speaking God's Name, are they subjective? Of course, because I'm a human being. And I am offering the fruit of my intellectual product. But are they systematic and rigorous? Absolutely. Subjective, perhaps, but systematic and rigorous. And so it is not a criticism or a critique to say you have subjective principles. So what? It's like saying, you know, you're describing what you see. Objectivity exists only in very few pure principles, like the belief that Allah is one. There's one. Allah is singular. That I believe to be an objective principle. But what we anchor ourselves in, and here I'm I don't want to overwhelm my audience with philosophy, but subjectivity is not whimsicalness. Now, what the argument, if those who read Speaking God's Name, the argument is that the objective principles that I appeal to the reader to accept are the principles of transparency and accountability and honesty in discourse. I believe honesty in itself is one of these very few principles that can claim objectivity. Now, honesty in discourse means that you have to allow autonomy to the reader. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have not read Speaking God's Name, and so you might not know what I'm talking about. But as a response to that question, it is what my critique in speaking in God's name is that when you speak in God's name and not recognize the autonomy of the agent, i.e. the vicegerent, the human being, the individual, to make decisions as to whether to defer to your authority or not, they cannot make an autonomous, informed decision to obey the law of God unless you unless you are truthful about the evidence regarding God's law. Now, I am not. That doesn't mean that ultimately, as myself, as an individual agent, I am not making subjective choices. Of course, I'm making subjective choices, but I must respect your right to make subjective choices as well. So many people misread Speaking God's Name in thinking that I am saying no one should make subjective choices. That's not an accurate reading. Okay.
Oh, sorry, and he follow-up. Can you please press the Sheikh on whether it is a matter of exegesis, reading out, or eisegesis, reading in? He didn't mean to imply whimsical. Or another time.
I mean, I embrace pain, so I'm gonna stay with you. But I'm worried about people here, paining them more than their endurance. And it's a really good question. And let me say, I'll answer it in short, and then I promise to come back to it, because that now really, I'm inspired to unpack the whole issue of methodology in another halaqa, inshallah. But it is both. Eisegesis is often where I employ to deduct the normative principle of a qawaid al-asliya. Exegesis is often what I employ to understand the context that informs the deduction of qawaid al-asliya. Now, if you guys didn't understand what the hell I'm talking about, it's okay. Just don't worry about it. But I will come to it, and I'll try to satisfy. Maybe, you know what? Because obviously these people have read. Maybe I should have a different session on a different day, just on the computer, to address these people, because I have a feeling that this is a completely different level of discourse.
All right.
And we can invite whoever wants to attend, but you know, those of you who just think that is too much, don't bother with it.
Okay.
So we can have. But then there was a question about
Yes, about madhab.
oh yeah, the madhab issue, and then the music issue for the people who are staying up late in England or wherever. The madhab commitment. Okay, let's put it this way. I do stick to a madhab, personally. But that is because I am fully invested in an understanding of what my madhab means. Even when I adopt minority views within my madhab, and I am a Shafi'i, I don't mind to tell you that. But I do not urge the Shafi'i madhab either upon Sharif or upon grace. because they have no knowledge of what that madhab commitment means. Because I was thoroughly raised studying the various madhabs, I cannot imagine breaking ranks with the Shafi'i madhab without feeling an enormous amount of guilt towards my teachers. But I cannot impose that normative stand upon. I deal with a lot with many Muslims, especially Muslims who are in the West, as if the early pioneers of Islam. The madhabs didn't develop for a few hundred years, and they must be allowed to investigate their own institutions of Islamicity within a Western identity. In the same way, for instance, in Indonesia and Malaysia, they developed the remarkable institution of adat laws. Of course, the Wahhabis now are trying to dismantle the adat laws in Malaysia and completely. But the adat laws allowed a synchronizing of Malaysian identity with Islamicity. In Andalusia, the equivalent of the adat laws for Spanish Muslims was so remarkable and so ingenious that when the Murabitun encountered it, the Murabitun were sort of a fundamentalist group of North African Muslims. They were scandalized by it. They thought the Spanish Muslims were not Muslims at all because they had their own synchronistic institutions. Well, guess what? Without synchronism, Islamic identity does not form and does not survive. And if you come to Western Muslims and say, fit within the preformed categories of Shi'ism, Sunniism, Shafi'ism, Hanafism, Malikism, you're going to break them. Even if you have a generation that listens to you, the next will completely be alienated. Alienated from Islam, alienated from... And like other generations of Muslims that have existed in the West, they will become extinct. We have to be smarter than that as Muslims. We can, like what I do with my children and what I do with my wife, they see how I am. But I must respect their autonomy to take what they see fit for their own normative identity. So I offer a model, but I don't impose my model. And that's my attitude towards the madhab. I follow a madhab. With my advanced students, I sort of expect them to follow a madhab. You know, if I know my student is a Hanafi and they break with something in the Hanafi school, I sort of raise an eyebrow and think like, okay, you know, what's going on with you? But I don't say anything. And I don't say anything because we're not in Azhar. And I must respect the fact that Islamic identity must be endlessly creative and must be the result of an endlessly dynamic negotiative process from within the native sources of every context that Islam encounters. This, by the way, brings me to music. Now, as I wrote about reasoning with God, I have a part about music and Sharia. I encourage anyone that is interested in music to read that, because I've gotten both a lot of praise for it and a lot of flack for it. You know, as always, a lot of Muslims, it's not comparing Sharia to music, it's scandalous. Anyway, now I listen to classical music all the time. I have an ear that is so tuned to classical music that when I even listen to jazz, I'm unraveled. To me, jazz is a heretical corruption. Rock music is silly. It's just a beat. I can tell the difference between the way Heifetz interprets Tchaikovsky's Second Sonata and the way Milstein or Isaac Stern or so on, different violinists interpret the music, and I get lost in the interpretation. And to me, that's an integral part of my relationship with Allah. I've said it. When I listen to different violinist interpretations, and by the way, Milstein and Isaac Stern and Heifetz, they're all Jewish, and they loved Israel to the point that they discounted the rights of Palestinians, and that I take against them. Because if you're such a refined musician, you should be able to be attuned to the suffering of others. And not being attuned to the suffering of Palestinians is something that offends me. So I have to forgive them for that to a point and listen to their music anyway. Because I expected more from them. And I say that because they all did a lot to serve Israel and promote the interests of Israel and so on. But this music is an integral part of, I hear God speaking when I listen to Heifetz perform Tchaikovsky. I hear God speaking when I hear a different interpretation of a composer. Now, if someone comes and tells me music's haram, I tell them, well, I wish you could come to one of my sessions with Allah when I listen to classical music. Now, when someone tells me metal music, everything in me cringes. To me, that scares me. It's something that jars my nerves. And I have to then revert back to my Usuli principles that force me to be just and fair, to allow acceptance to something that I find remarkably distasteful, because other peoples don't have my sensibilities. This is what Usulism does, is that it makes you principled in the way you approach things. Now, I've heard some metal music that talks a lot about demonic stuff. And I've also read that this is a gross misunderstanding of metal music, that a lot of metal music does not talk about worshiping the devil or spilling the blood of people or killing cops or slaughtering women. That a lot of metal music has elevating messages and actually says something that is poetry. And I've actually read some lyrics that sounded very poetical. To me, it's jarring. I can't consider it music. It makes me think it's like, modernistic art. It's jarring. It's like, what the hell is that? But my Usuli principles force me to be fair and not impose my subjective feelings upon others. And so if it allows you to find God and doesn't bring you closer to the devil and doesn't open portals to possession by the devil, by demonic beings, because that's also reality, then I respect it. Then it's your right.
Are you doing anything?
Let's see. Okay, so if you had a magic wand, and what would be your 20-year roadmap to building institutions that you think would make a difference for, American Muslims? And how would those institutions be different than what I think we have, the institutions that I think that exist today, but maybe it's, not what you're thinking of what institutions should be. I'm thinking of institutions like Zaytuna and there are others that are there. But how would that be different?
The difference is, I mean, and again, I want. There are intellectuals that thrive within a ghetto intellectual environment, and intellectuals that thrive within the standards of set by the public academia. In other words, unfortunately, a lot of the intellectuals in our Muslim institutions would not be able to get an academic job anywhere else because their credentials, because they're not the cream of the crop credentially. I want institutions that compete. I don't want institutions that hire those that are unhireable anywhere else. That's one. Second, I don't want intellectuals that are regurgitate what we already know, what I can get by reading this book in the tradition or that book in the tradition. I want intellectuals that are analytically on the cutting edge. That it's the same way I deal with my graduate students. If you're not going to offer something new, some original thought, then shut up. That's very different from our Muslim institutions right now, where they basically regurgitate the same stuff over and over and over. What I dream of are these Muslim intellectuals that are studying things that are original, that engage the analytical paradigms that the rest of the world engage, that can talk. I mean, I listened to a public debate between Robert George, who's a famous Christian philosopher of natural law, and a Muslim interlocutor. I'm sad to say that the Muslim interlocutor had no idea what natural law is about. I had no idea what philosophy of natural law is about. And in many ways, Robert George picked a straw man to knock down. Because when you listen to that debate, you're impressed by the Christian tradition and completely unimpressed by the Islamic tradition if you actually know anything about natural law. What I want is something very different. I want that who engages Robert George to be an intellectual of the first order in the natural law tradition. Now, that means there are a lot of very accomplished Muslims around the world. My 20-year trajectory is that there would have, very much like what the Ismaili Institute did for the Ismaili tradition in England. The Ismaili Institute reintroduced the importance of the Ismaili tradition, but not by picking a first-rate academic who ran the institute to bring together first-rate intellectuals and produce cutting-edge scholarship that is respected by everyone. I mean, you don't have to be an Ismaili to actually engage, to be forced to engage their intellectual product. We need something that can become like a Mecca for Muslim intellectuals, but with a demanding intellectual standards. That's the 20-year. What I would dream of is that we would have plenty of fellowships where people can come do postdoctorate. That there would be a board of advisors of 6 very accomplished intellectuals who would review postgraduate proposals, then approve fellowships for postgraduate. People would come for 3 years to do postgraduate research on various topics. That there would be sponsorship of publications of innovative research in Islamic theology and Islamic history and gender studies and the various things we talked about last time. There would be professorships created within the institute, research professorships, tenured positions for 3 or 4 senior researchers who are of the caliber of in the non-Muslim context, Patricia Crone in the Institute of Advanced Studies in England or the like, people who have a track record of distinguished publications, who then are hired by the Institute to do nothing but hold seminars, hold 2 weeks courses, or 1 month long or 3 month long courses, and do research and publish. That would be, and hold a series of symposia and conferences on the most pressing intellectual issues that confront Muslims. I would honestly love to have a conference, for instance, on how many, and serious statistical studies done, on how many Muslims marry non-Muslims and why. Because I think, I get this from the number of emails I get every single week by Muslim women who want to marry non-Muslim men, I get the sense that it's a real crisis, that the attrition rate is extremely high. But there's no scholarship. There is ways you can do really important research in this. We can statistically know how many people are marrying non-Muslims, and we can do scholarship to actually investigate why. Not anecdotal, not impressionistic, but real research. But it needs funding. And it needs a committee of qualified people to ask for proposals, applications for people to come do the research, and then issue these grants for people who would come for 5 years or 3 years and do the research and get the research published. It's a very different paradigm. It's a very different paradigm.
So is money the only obstacle?
Money and getting the demanding academic qualifications in place. It's like I told Claremont a long time ago when they said, it came and told me, we want to sponsor something Muslim. And I told them, don't create a straw man of Islamicity, because you can hire a Muslim intellectual that would challenge you intellectually. Claremont is a Christian school that can engage you at the same level when you talk about Christian theology, who can read theology as an international discourse and can engage you at the same level intellectually. Or you can hire Muslims who are not nearly as qualified as you, and so can never engage you at the same level of intellectual discourse. And so effectively you're creating a straw man that you can knock down. You create an Islamic representation, but it's an Islamic representation that is always inferior to your Christian identity. And they listened to me, and the response, unfortunately, was not to give tenure to that poor guy, what was his name? Hamid Navani, who was of the caliber to engage them intellectually. He didn't give him tenure and ended up hiring people who are strawmen. Now, it was remarkable because, these were many meetings, but there wasn't enough intellectual awareness on part of Muslims to understand the importance of what they were hearing. It's like saying, well, yeah, that guy is good enough. What's wrong with him? He sounds smart to me. Well, the issue is not that he sounds smart to you. The issue is that he sounds smart to people, what is the word I'm looking for? Peers. That there would be a process of peer review. And that the academic peers would say, this person is qualified. Sir. I'm sorry, who are you?
Faisal Burhan.
I know, sir.
They drove 50 miles to come join us.
Oh, I'm sorry.
just
But
one
God will
question.
reward you for all the pain. And also that pain is a great teacher. So.
And after this, we should pray Maghrib.
Should I ask or should you? Why do you think we or someone should follow or take an aspirative normative in the Usuli community? In other words, what is it that in the Quran or Sunnah or elsewhere that I should believe in what you, in your aspirations?
This is actually a really good question. The question is fundamentally, what is it? I'll rephrase it. What is Islamic about saying that you have to take an aspirational stand? What is why look at ideals in the first place? And from even. Keep in mind, I will answer this inshallah through the series of halaqas, because the whole halaqa is actually a justification for the Usuli paradigm. But the very gift of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the very gift, and I will, in a halaqa I'll talk about that phrase, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, is in itself an aspirational statement, in that whatever we do, whatever we engage in, whatever, whether it's sitting, talking, eating, sleeping, waking, we are offering a prayer, an aspiration, an ideal, that it is not in the name. In the name is just a ritual, but the reality of that ritual is what? With the accompaniment. It's not a word, I've invented it. Accompaniment. Okay, you say it again.
Accompaniment.
Accompaniment. برفقة. And Allah that is the merciful and compassionate. When Allah challenges us and says, your life in the hayati, your life, your existence, your nusuk, your supplications, even your death, is for Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, as the Quran says. When Allah challenges us and says, be steadfast, giving testimony for God and injustice, even if it's against yourself and others. When Allah challenges us and says, what distinguishes your ummah from other ummahs, and again in the Quran, that your ummah is there to attest injustice, in the name of God, injustice, and tells us that the ideal for your ummah is al-wasatiyya, is moderation. When I read from the Prophet ﷺ that Allah rafiq yuhibbu rifqa fi kulli shay, that Allah is tender and loves tenderness in everything. If all of these are, you could, as I said, you could turn it into a meaningless ritual, or it could become an exciting engagement with the divine. And what Qadi Abdul Jabbar talks about is Qadi Abdul Jabbar, one of, again, the most premier philosophers in all of human history, and the philosopher who inspired Maimonides and his legacy of Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas and so on. And he has a remarkable discourse on that Quranic taklif, that Quranic obligation of testifying for God in justice. And it says, well, the first obligation is the understanding of justice. And it says, well, but we know that the understanding of justice is necessarily subjective and contextual. So how do we then negotiate that duty of comprehending justice and then comprehending it to an extent that we become, to testify for justice, you must embody justice. You must become the nation of justice. And what does this mean for Muslims to have that obligation to become the nation of justice? Now, I wish Qadi Abdul Jabbar would come today and see the state of Muslims. I mean, I think he would cry. This is not the nation of justice. I mean, Qadi Abdul Jabbar, at least in his time, could dream that Muslims would be the nation of justice, despite all the challenges. But it is anchored in the very nature of the Quranic revelation. I mean, the Quran is not a book of rituals. And the Quran is not a book of meaningless supplication or supplications that affirm the ego in a salvational sense. The Quran is a book of inspiration to human beings. And that is why it is the final revelation. If the Quran, earlier prophets relied on the miraculous, on the miracles, and they would be seen by the people of their age and believed because it's a miracle, but then the next generation denies that it ever happened. The Quran has the distinction of being the miracle of discourse. That is the miracle of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And the miracle of discourse is the miracle of challenging humanity to be a paradigm, to be the embodiment of justice, mercy and compassion and beauty. And what the Usuli methodology is to say, what are the principles for a paradigm of justice, mercy, compassion and beauty? What are the foundational principles for us to meaningfully talk about justice, mercy, compassion, and beauty? I don't know how you can get more Islamic than that. The other alternative is sort of the Ahl al-Hadith, form of Islamist submission and nothing else, which is a form of hedonism, because it is the whole purpose of obedience is obedience. And it is contrary, in my view, to Tawheed. Because Allah, it implies that Allah gets something from obedience, and Allah doesn't get anything other than wanting us to thrive. As Allah tells us repeatedly in the Quran, whether you believe or not doesn't affect Allah. And whether you obey or not doesn't affect Allah anyway. So why does Allah want us to bear witness? It's for us, for our own good. And we must embrace that in our relationship with Allah. If we truly embrace that, and this is my enthusiasm and my zeal as a Muslim, and which I want to infect other Muslims with. If we embrace that, we would become, not like human beings that can find themselves deteriorate into a dehumanization. It's like when a lot of human beings commit crimes, they say, "Oh, I don't even remember the murder." They're actually not lying. I don't remember the act of violence. They're not lying. They have no anchor. It's like Colin Wilson says, they're not anchored in a purpose. And so it becomes very easy for them to devolve into something subhuman. When you're anchored in Allah, you are anchored in a purpose. And the purpose is always clear. And the purpose, the paradigm of justice, anchored on Usuli principles. Usuli means anchored on foundational principles. It's so clear that you do not waver back and forth with the whimsies of life. You're a strong human being. And as a strong human being, you can offer strength to others. And that's what I lament the most. Whenever I find someone devolving into becoming a terrorist criminal, I know that that person has lost their anchor. If they were anchored on Allah, they wouldn't ever devolve into an act of sheer annihilation. They would live for Allah, not just die and kill others. And whenever Muslims become absorbed in consumption, worrying about their bottom line and whether they have enough assets, I know they devolved as human beings. Because they see not justice, not beauty, not the shining of justice and beauty onto others, but simply money, which is the big idol. I mean, that's the topic of another age. But money is truly the idols of Mecca that we worship endlessly. We pay homage to, but maybe because I don't have any, so it's easy for me. But for those who have it, they worship it. If you don't have it, then alhamdulillah, you don't worship it.
Jazakumullah khair.
If you don't have it, then let's hug.
Let's pray, Mocha.
Okay, let's pray.